Great. Okay. Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to National Geographic Learning's third Best Practice webinar. So we are both live on Facebook, and also now we have around 300 attendees in this webinar room, and more teachers are joining in now. You may have noticed that this is the first time we have our Asia webinar at this time, right? It's for some people it's 4 p.m., some 3 p.m. It's because we have a very special guest speaker today. So now please allow me to introduce our speaker today. John, yes, thank you. So yes, we have John Hughes, the legendary, okay, from UK with us here today. John is an award-winning ELT author with 30 years of experience in teaching and teacher training. He has trained and worked with teachers from all over the world, and he is also a very well-known conference presenter. Lots of you may have taught or know some of his titles for National Geographic Learning, including World English, World Link, Life, and also the methodology title, Critical Thinking in ELT. So we are very happy to have John here with us in Asia. John, thank you very much, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Kitty, and thank you the whole team in Asia for putting this together, and thank you all for coming. Can you just say hello in the chat box to check that you can hear and see me? I've got my chat box open and I will be using the chat box throughout this session. So I'm hoping that we'll get ideas from you. This is a session about creativity. So I'm hoping to generate a little bit of creative thinking in the chat box. So nice to see so many people here from different parts of the world. I thought I was talking to Asia, but I seem to be talking to people from all sorts of different continents. So that's great to see. We're going to be looking at the topic of creativity in the classroom. And I suppose one of the initial questions to ask is why creativity? We can talk about the importance of creativity in the English language classroom for a number of reasons. As Huang's just said, it's a hot topic for ELT teachers. It is a hot topic, but we need to ask why it's a hot topic. One reason is it's regarded as a 21st century skill. When we talk about the 4 C's, we talk about critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and we talk about creativity. And certainly in the world of work, if you're working with students who are going to go on into the world of work, the ability to think creatively is one of the top skills that companies now look for. But I think there's another reason, of course, and that's creativity and creative thinking is fun in the classroom. It adds an element of playfulness. It's about playing with language. It's about risk-taking. It's about having original ideas and letting students express themselves. And it's about personalization. And all of these things, I think, make language learning more memorable. Let's take a look. I'm going to take sort of 7 steps. And the first thing I want to do is start trying to define what we mean by creativity. So while I'm talking, if you want in the chat box, feel free to write some words or phrases that you think define creativity, and I'll continue talking and we'll see what ideas come from me and what ideas come from you. So Mia's just said innovation. We've got thinking out of the box, the arts. Few ideas going on in the chat box. That's great. Let me take one type of definition, which is that we can talk about creativity in terms of big C creativity and little c creative thinking. And what we mean here is that with big C creativity, we're talking about things like the arts, the products of creativity. So if you think of famous artists, famous musicians, famous writers, they are people who've produced something. And so we talk about big C creativity. The focus is very much on the product. Then we can talk about little c creative thinking, which is more about the process, and it refers much more to what we do in everyday life. We have creative thoughts. In the chat box, some of you have written words like innovation, originality, new ideas, imagination. These are things that we can all share in. We don't have to be great artists. They're things we do every day of our lives. And they're things that we can do in the classroom quite easily to make language learning more interesting. So when we're defining creativity and creative thinking, we need to think of it in these two different ways. Let's take an example of how big C creativity may affect us in the classroom. This is where we're concerned with like an end product or the work of other artists. We can use this in the classroom. For example, this is a spread from a book I've written called Life. Some of you may have taught from it. This was one of the units in Life where we looked at paintings by famous artists around the world, from different countries, from Japan, from Europe, from Brazil, Latin America. And students had to look at the paintings. We taught them the language they needed to talk about art and creativity, and they expressed a preference. So that's one way of using creativity, but it's quite receptive. It's about the students responding to other people's creativity. Another way in which they might do this is, again, another example from a course book I wrote, where students looked at the photos of a famous photographer called Rainer Gerritsen. You can see at the top of the page there, it says the photos of Rainer Gerritsen. Rainer Gerritsen is an interesting photographer. He has a fantastic website, if you just Google his name, where he specializes in photographs of real people, but not like photo stock images of people, but genuine people in different situations. And I love his photographs because they show real people, and they're great for teaching the vocabulary of appearance and feelings, and students are talking about real photographs, which makes him a particularly interesting and useful artist or creator to use in the English language classroom. And what's great about this lesson is that by the end of the lesson, the students then choose a photograph, they show it to the rest of the class, and they give a presentation, and they practice the language for talking about pictures and photographs. So it's an example of using big C creativity in the classroom. But again, it's about students responding to art rather than students being creative themselves. And what I'm interested in is mainly in little c creative thinking. How can we get students using their own creativity to help them learn language? And the focus there is more on getting them to speak and write. So it's particularly useful for the productive skills. So let's take a closer look at creative thinking, or little c creative thinking. Okay. One way in which we define creative thinking is dealt with by a book by McGregor. I'll give you the references at the end. She wrote a fantastic book called Developing Thinking, and a lot of my thinking about creativity and so on is based on her work. But one definition of creative thinking is divergent thinking. And some of you have mentioned thinking outside the box. And typically, we associate creative thinking with thinking outside the box, or divergent thinking. It's a response to a problem, a situation, an issue, a need, a task, or a challenge. So if we give students a problem to do in the classroom, we get them to use their divergent thinking. We get them to think outside the box. Now, the classic study of divergent thinking to test someone's divergent thinking, famously, there's something called the paperclip test, which you may have heard of. The paperclip test is how many ideas can you come up with for the use of a paperclip without clipping paper together. So it's designed to clip paper, but are there other ways in which you could use it? So you'd have to use your divergent thinking. So in the chat box, while I'm talking, just brainstorm some new and original ways to use a paper clip. So Sarah said, let's use it as a hair clip. Very nice, Sarah, thank you. Any other ideas? Earrings, absolutely. A couple of people suggesting earrings. A lock picker, so Ryan's a bit of a thief. Skipping rope. Interesting, interesting. A ring, a hair clip, a hanger, a guitar pick. Nice idea. I haven't heard that one before. A bookmark is a nice one. Yeah. A sewing needle. Yeah, maybe a button. All sorts of great divergent thinking ideas going on in the chat box. Now, a picture stand, good one. A piece of art. Lots of divergent thinking activities, and the paperclip test was used in a famous study where they gave the paperclip to young learners, so children aged around 7 and 8, and the children were able to generate up to 100 and maybe more ideas. Then a few years later, they gave the paperclip to the same students. By now they were teenagers, and they were able to generate about 50 ideas or so. And then when they became adults, they gave the paperclip to the adults, and the adults could maybe come up with 20 or 25 ideas. Now, the conclusion from this was that in some way, as students went through the education system, their number of creative thinking ideas, their divergent thinking was being reduced by education, that because of education and exams, we were limiting creativity. And there's a very famous TED talk by Ken Robinson where he talks about, is education killing creativity? And that teachers should spend more time using creative thinking in the classroom. I think actually English language teachers are pretty good at including creativity in the classroom. We do it a lot and we understand the importance of it. I don't think education, well, that's an interesting point from Wei Fong. He says, I don't think students want to give the wrong answer. Absolutely. Creative thinking is about taking risks. And if we want a creative thinking classroom, students have to feel that they can say the wrong thing, or there isn't always a right, wrong answer. And that's limiting for them, particularly if they have to pass exams. So yes, in Ken Robinson's talk, there is this concern. For me personally, I also think as we get older, we start to apply other types of thinking, which perhaps means that we can think creatively, we think divergently, but then we start to ask questions about it. And we'll come to that in a minute. How does this work in the English language classroom? Well, typically an example of divergent thinking would be if we show students a photograph at the beginning of a lesson. So in the life books that I've written, we often show a photograph at the beginning of the unit. And we want students to use their divergent thinking. We want them to brainstorm ideas. So if you look at the photo here, why do you think the table's in the desert? Maybe you want to say in the chat box why you think this table is in the desert. And there are different reasons. There are the obvious reasons. Well, obviously somebody put it in the desert. Maybe, yes, nomadic people, Mailka, would going through the desert. Somebody's enjoying afternoon tea. Maybe somebody's camping. Maybe it's Photoshop. Nice idea. There's going to be a desert party. It's a door to a secret base. Great idea from Rachel. So suddenly we start with the obvious, and then students start generating wider ideas. They think outside the box. They use their divergent thinking. And that's why photos are a great way of generating creative thinking at the beginning of the lesson. So it's great for divergent thinking, and brainstorming is one of those typical things that we use in the classroom. So it's great for creative thinking. Typically, English language teachers use creative thinking at the beginning of the lesson. So they'll brainstorm ideas, talk about a photograph and so on. And we often use it at the end. Now, this lesson you're looking at here, this comes from a video lesson where students watch a video about a man who discovers a camera and the camera has photographs of him sleeping, and the camera's owned by a woman, and he goes in search of the woman to give her the camera back. And at the end of the lesson, students are then asked to complete a dialogue. They have to imagine that the man meets the woman or talks to her on the telephone, and they have a dialogue. And so they generate a dialogue between the man and the woman, and then they perform it for the rest of the class. So they watch the video, and then they write the dialogue of what happens after the video. So they have to use their divergent thinking, and they have to write something. So what we're getting at here is that creativity is good for divergent thinking, but it's great for speaking, and it's also great for writing practice. And it makes the whole process very memorable. But it's typically, we often use it at the beginning and the end of the class, and we'll come back to perhaps why that is. So creative thinking is, we think about divergent thinking, but that isn't the whole definition of what makes good creative thinking. Now, earlier in the chat box, somebody mentioned critical thinking, and I think there's an important relationship between creative thinking and critical thinking, and it's important to understand this relationship because both of them are what we call higher order thinking. But there's an important relationship between them. We'll go back to a diagram I showed you before. We talked about creative thinking, divergent thinking, thinking outside the box. It's important that we think creatively about problems and situations and so on. But we can also talk about critical thinking, which is convergent thinking. So creative thinking is outside the box. Creative thinking is concerned with information and data. It's about understanding information and data. Sometimes it's reading between the lines or understanding what it is the writer or the speaker is trying to say. And usually there's a correct answer. So it requires convergent thinking, what we might call thinking inside the box. The interesting thing, yes, Geraldine's mentioned the word analyzing, evaluating. Those are two terms from Bloom's taxonomy that are synonymous with critical thinking. And there's an important relationship because sometimes we talk about thinking outside the box, but also creative thinking benefits when we think inside the box. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes teachers say to me, my students find it very hard to be creative. They don't have original ideas. They can't think outside the box. But actually, for many people, we are more creative when we think inside the box, when we set limits to a task. For example, if in a lesson I've taught 10 new words, and I say to my students, for homework, I want you to write me a 100-word story and use all of those 10 words in your story, students will find that a lot easier to do than if I say, go home and write a story. Because if I say to the students, go home, write a story, they'll say, well, what's the story about? Because you're asking them just to think divergently. But if you ask them to use convergent thinking and say, here are the limits, only use 100 words and use those 10 words, students will find it a lot easier to do that task. And it's a much better language teaching device because you're encouraging them to use the 10 new words, but you're setting limitations. And creative thinking often comes out of limitations. And when we understand our limitations, what the limitations are, it helps us to be more creative. So I don't always agree when teachers say my students aren't creative. I think we just have to create the right conditions. Let me give you a real example, okay? This is an activity you can use in class. Do you all recognize the fish on the slides? Thank you. Sarah has said it's Nemo. Nemo is fairly international, so Nemo is a good example. Nemo was produced by Pixar, which is part of Disney. If you want an example of one of the most creative companies in the world, we think of Pixar. They produce brilliant films and they're brilliant storytellers. We can say their animation is fantastic, but actually what makes Pixar successful is their storytelling. And Pixar have a secret. And if you watch any of their films like Toy Story, Nemo, any of their films, if you use your critical thinking, you can identify how they structure all their stories. Their secret is they use something called the Pixar Code. And the Pixar Code is a 6-sentence structure. And you can use this with your students. If you ever ask your students to write a story, they'll start writing and then they'll kind of lose their way and the story has no structure. But if you teach them the Pixar Code, they will produce a story very quickly. So Pixar has 6 sentences. Once upon a time, every day, one day, because of that, until finally. Every Pixar movie follows this structure, and many other famous films follow this structure as well. If you teach it to students, for example, once upon a time there was a fish called Nemo. Every day Nemo went to school. One day Nemo disappeared. Because of that, his father went to look for him. Because of that, his father found him in Australia until finally his father brought Nemo home. That's basically the film. That's the story. And you can apply it to any other Pixar film. I have children, I've watched lots of Pixar movies, and to make it more interesting for me, I've sat there using my critical thinking and analyzed the story structure, okay? But if you teach it to your students and say, now write a story, your students actually will generate a story quite quickly. Give them the first sentence. So if I said, once upon a time, there was an English language student from the Philippines, I'd give them that first sentence. Very quickly, they would generate the rest of the story. So it's about giving students certain limitations to work within, and then their creative thinking will go really quickly. Try this activity with your students tomorrow. You can use it with children, but I've used it with business people. I actually learned this from a business book. And the idea is that you teach it to your business, your adult students, and say, tell the story of your company. So once upon a time, there was a board employee. Every day that employee went to work. And one day he had an amazing idea. And because of that, he set up a company. So you're kind of telling the story of how a company exists. So you can use it with adults, you can use it with younger learners as well. But it helps them to be creative because you're giving them a scaffold, basically. Try it with your students. Let me give you a real example from a course book, how we use it. If you pick up Life, the books, the influence of convergent or critical thinking with creative divergent thinking is there in the books. If you've ever used Life, you know that critical thinking is an important feature. But the structure, the relationship between critical and creative thinking is always there. We always have the critical thinking exercise. In this case, students have analyzed a reading text. They've analyzed the language for giving advice and suggesting. They've identified important language for doing those things in the text. So they've applied their convergent critical thinking. And then they have to write pieces of advice. So they've read a text about healthy food and healthy eating. They've analyzed the advice, analyzed the information and data, thought inside the box. And then the last activity, they get to use their creative thinking and come up with their own advice. So that relationship between critical and creative thinking is really important. You've asked the question, is critical thinking about setting limits? Critical thinking is about understanding the structure of something. What are the limitations we're working within? But I don't mean limitations in a negative way. I mean limitations in terms of telling us the structure. If creative thinking is thinking outside the box, critical thinking is understanding the dimensions of the box. What is it made of? What are the dimensions? What am I working within? So it sort of sets limits, which helps the students. We have a very famous musician in the UK who's called David Bowie. Some of you may have heard of him. David Bowie used to say, the only music I'll ever listen to is the music I can steal from. What he meant was he thought critically about other people's music, learnt how they'd structured their music, and then he went off and was more creative. And you can find all sorts of examples of that from great creators. So there's thinking outside the box, thinking inside the box. Okay, let's move on. Some more practical ideas. Another way to be creative in the classroom is both for the teacher and the students to break their habits or break their routines of thinking. What I mean here is, as teachers, we have our favorite lessons, yes? You have those lessons you do that you know always work with your students. And as teachers, we often get into routines. We have certain ways of teaching things. But actually, creativity tends to happen when we break our routines or we break our habits. This is something Ken Robinson advises in his work on creative thinking, that we break out of our habits and routines. Let me give you an example. I live very near Oxford in England, and I do some work with students in Oxford. I like to go teach the students, and also I test out my materials in the books. And one day I was teaching a class of students, and I was teaching a lesson. It was about the rules for visitors going to Australia. And the students read the text. And then what I wanted to do was teach the students the grammar of have to, don't have to, can, can't. So the grammar of rules, yeah? In England, for example, you have to drive on the left-hand side. In your country, you probably have to drive on the right-hand side. I don't know why in England we like to do it differently. What can I say? So I wanted to teach the students the grammar of rules. Now, typically, in the lesson I've taught for years and years, I've been teaching nearly 30 years, I would always say to the students, now write some rules about your country. And typically the students would write rules like that. You have to drive on the right, you don't have to wear a school uniform. So rules about their country. Now that's fine. It's memorable use of the language, it's personalization. But on this particular day, I thought to myself, well, I've been teaching the lesson this way for years and years and years. It's time I did something different. So I braked my habit. So instead, I put the students into 3 groups. And I said, I want you to create a new country. So in your group, come up with a name of a new country. And I had 3 groups in the class. And they came up with 3 new countries. They came up with the country of Sea Island, which sounds like a very nice place to live. One group had students from Moldova and Syria in, so they created a new country called Moldo-Syria. And then a third group, maybe you can guess which countries they came from, because the third group was listening to the second group and they thought, what a great idea to merge the names of our countries. So Italy was one of the countries that they had. Romania was the second country. There's one other. Romania, not Belarus, but good guess. Brazil, correct. Rachel got it. It was Brazil. So Brazil, Romania, Italy, that group. And I thought that was a nice example of creative thinking. You need to come up with the name of a country, so you merge them. Great idea. Then I asked them to write new rules for their country. So here they had to use their creative thinking. And after some discussion and some writing, here are some of the rules they came up with. On Sea Island, you can swim with the dolphins, you don't have to pay taxes. Sea Island sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Wonderful place. I'd like to go there. Moldo-Syria was a bit more right-wing. You have to study English, you can't have a car, you have to cycle. So quite strict kind of country, okay? And then Rome and Italy was my favorite country because they were the most creative thinking, and they were thinking outside of the box. And they said, in the morning, you have to drive on the right, and in the evening, you have to drive on the left. I thought a wonderful piece, wonderful example of divergent thinking, creative thinking. So all I'm saying here, I'm not presenting anything particularly new in a sense, but all I'm saying is sometimes as teachers, we get into our routines and habits, and routines and habits are important, and students like routines and habits. They like to know what the pattern of learning and teaching is. But sometimes step out of those habits and creativity happens in the classroom. And my students remember this lesson much better than if I just have them write sentences about their own country. Suddenly the creative thinking makes it so much more memorable, and it's a way of making the grammar more memorable. So break your habits sometimes, okay? Tip number 5, remember the 7 steps. So we're moving on. Step 5, ask higher order thinking questions. I was talking about critical and creative thinking, and I think one of the most important aspects of that is that we have to ask the right type of questions. And there have been interesting studies and research done in the classroom on the types of questions that teachers ask. And a study that was done in the year around 2001, this was a study done in the UK. They recorded teachers teaching their lessons, and they listened to the teachers teaching, and then they analyzed the types of questions they were asking. They worked out that the typical teacher, on average, asks about 2 questions per minute. That's 400 questions a day you're asking. How many questions do you ask a day, do you think? Type it in the chat box. They think that we're asking about 400 a day. I don't know. You might ask less. I don't know. They also listened to the recordings of teachers, and they noticed that in a lifetime, you're probably asking 70,000 a year. That's 2 to 4 million questions in a career. That's a heck of a lot of questions that teachers ask. But when you listen to the questions that teachers are asking, only in one test, there's 4% of them were higher order and 8% in another lesson. So that means that over 90% of those 400 questions per day are lower order thinking questions. They're not about critical thinking, and they're not about creative thinking. There are things like, how are you? Did you do your homework? Can you sit there? Can you open your books? Now, a lot of that's classroom management, which is fine, but creative thinking cannot happen if we're not asking the right questions. And if only maybe 4 to 8% of the questions are higher order, there's no opportunity for the students to be creative. Kathleen said no to yes, no questions. There is an issue here that a lot of our questions that we ask in class are closed questions. So they're yes, no type questions. And what we need to do is ask more open-ended questions, as Santa's just said in the chat box. Questions like how and why, Hubert said, more discussion questions. So yes, no questions are important for checking, but more open questions are important. The other thing when you ask the questions is, of course, the time that you leave. In the research, they said when teachers ask lower order thinking questions, sometimes they're only leaving 1 or 2 seconds. They need to leave at least 3 seconds for the students to think. And for higher order thinking questions, maybe 10 seconds or more. I would say more, actually. I think in a language classroom, you need to leave a long time for students to come up with answers to higher order thinking questions. And that's why we put students in pairs and in groups and say, here are your higher order thinking questions. Get into groups and discuss them and then report back. So that wait time is really important, that thinking time. And we can't underestimate it as teachers. The other thing that they noticed in the study that I thought was important was that on average, students were only asking one question per class. Students can't be creative if they're not given the chance to ask questions as well. So as teachers, we need to create classrooms where we're teaching the grammar of questions, but we're also allowing time and space for students to create their own questions. Creative thinking, part of creative thinking and also critical thinking is, of course, questioning. Let me give you a practical example of what I mean here. The photo on the screen is taken from a book, Life. Can any of you guess what? This was a photo at the beginning of the unit. What do you think the topic of the unit was? Any guesses why I chose this photo? I really like this photo. Communication, strangers, socializing, generation gap. Yep, collaboration, cycles of life, shopping, technology. Any of those could be correct. The test of a good photograph and why National Geographic photographs work so well is that quite often you find a good photograph that will work for different topics and generate different interest. And the other important thing about the photograph, it automatically gets students asking questions. The students are asking, why are the women there? What are they waiting for? What are they doing? I actually use this photograph on the topic of generations and stages in life, or cycles in life, as somebody said, but you could use it in different ways. The other important thing, here's a little tip. When you're choosing photographs to use in the classroom, black and white photographs are often more effective. Not always, but they can be more effective because you don't have the colors there. And if you show a photograph to students and it's in color and you ask students to describe it, they often talk about the colors. If you remove the color, they have to focus more on the people in the photographs, and they tend to use a bit more creative thinking. That's just a little tip. So sometimes I prefer black and white photographs. Now, if I was to use this in the classroom, what type of questions would I ask the students? Well, I would ask lower order thinking questions. It's important to use lower order thinking questions because you want to check students' vocabulary, and photographs are fantastic for teaching vocabulary. So I might ask them, who can you see? Where are they? What are they holding? Just to get them thinking about the picture. And it's often useful to start with the lower order thinking questions. But then I want to start asking creative thinking questions. So my creative thinking questions would be, well, what do you think the two women are saying to each other? What do you think they're talking about? What do you think the younger woman is texting? Do you think the younger woman is listening to the two older women and what she's saying about them to her friends? So what's happening here is I'm getting the students to use their imagination and their creative thinking. And then the next, and also what do you think will happen next? So they're speculating and predicting about the picture. And then I might say to the students, okay, can you write me 3 questions for one of the women? So the students have to choose a woman in the photograph and write 3 questions. And that's where they generate the questions. So you see what we're doing here. We're going from lower order thinking questions to higher order thinking questions to get their creative thinking going. And finally, they're generating questions for one of the women. Now, what I'm doing there is encouraging students to know that it's okay for them to ask questions. And sometimes my teachers say, well, students don't ask questions. They don't think creatively. They don't ask questions. As teachers, it's our job to create an environment where students feel like it's okay to ask questions. Okay, so that would be my tip number 5. Ask lower order thinking questions, the checking, the yes, no questions. They're important, but then remember to move on to the higher order thinking questions and use them with photographs. Okay. Ignite their curiosity, Francis has just said in the chat box. I like that. Ignite their curiosity. Okay, tip number 6. If you want students to think creatively and to think critically, you need to allow thinking time. Sometimes you can put students under pressure, but generally students need thinking time. There was a survey done with business people around the world. They interviewed 500 CEOs of important big companies. And they asked the question, when and where do you have your most creative ideas? These were people who go to work every day. So when you have a problem, when and where do you have creative ideas? In the chat box, can you just type where you think you have your most creative ideas? Where are you, or what are you doing? Alone time we've got, when there's silence, late at night, in a hut, in the bath. showering, at the cafe, in the loo, under a tree, when you're swimming, while you're cycling, while you're walking the dog, at night, while reading, by the seashore, when drinking coffee, at Starbucks, at church, when there's a problem, when you're dreaming. Now, what's interesting is all your ideas in the chat box. Let's look at the top 3 answers, because this was a survey of 500 people. What did they say? They said on vacation. Some of you put on holiday, I think, on vacation. Number 2 was in the shower. Some of you said in the shower, in the bath, in the loo. And the number 3 top answer was traveling to and from work. Now, what I thought about this was no one answered actually at work. I don't have creative ideas while I'm at work. No one gave that answer. And it's interesting because in the chat box, you're all teachers, I assume, none of you said actually while I'm at work or in the classroom. Oh, Andrew does. Okay, some of you do. But in general, we have our creative ideas outside of work, to and from work, in the shower. Now, what do we learn from this? Creativity in the classroom is important, but sometimes when we give students creative thinking tasks, we need to give them thinking time, which relates back to that wait time after you've asked a question. But it's also, students need creative thinking tasks for homework. They need to go home and spend some time thinking so that when they're traveling to and from school or to and from university, that's when their creative thinking might happen. So it means that homework is really important. And sometimes for homework, you'll say to the students, do the workbook or do the online activities, do the true false type questions. But sometimes students need to go away and think about it. Let me give you an example. This is a page from Life. And on this part of the course book, students, they read a travel blog. Then they analyze the language, they look at the use of so and because, and then they have to write their own piece of travel writing. Now, that's in exercise 4 here. They have to write a travel blog about a journey or going on holiday, and they think about these questions and then they write a paragraph. Now, I could do this in class, but actually it needs thinking time. The questions help them write it, but they're going to need time. So actually, sometimes when you're doing a page in a course book, you can say, okay, for this exercise, I want you to do it for homework and then bring it back to class. Because actually, creative thinking tasks just require time, and that's okay. You can't necessarily put them under pressure to come up with the best ideas. And obviously students want time to think about the language they're going to use, because our language students are not just having creative thinking ideas, they're then thinking of what is the language I need to express those ideas. So they've got a double time. Junard mentioned in the chat box, what about thinking time before answering questions? I think that's a really good point, that sometimes when we get students to do speaking activities, they need preparation time. They just need thinking time to take notes. Sometimes I get students to do classroom presentations, but I give them preparation time at home so they've had time to think about it. So it's kind of an obvious thing in a way, but I think often as teachers we forget it, that students just need that time, and maybe their best ideas aren't always going to happen in the classroom. Which brings us to number 7. Number 7 is to share like an artist. What I mean here is that part of being a creator or an artist is that you finally show your work. And that's an important part of creative thinking. Sometimes creative thinking is problem solving, so students are using that to solve a problem in class. But you want to give students the chance to demonstrate that thinking. In the chat box, Eugenia's just written to publish or perform. Exactly. I mean, I think students like that moment because there's an end product. And we talked about big C, little c. They've done the little c creative thinking, but they want to present their work of art at the end. What do I mean here? Well, it might be that they've written a story or a poem and they want to write and read it aloud. Maybe they put it around the classroom, or they put it on the classroom blog so other people can read it. Maybe they do poster presentations, so they get large sheets of paper, they work in groups, they put their ideas on a big poster, and then they show it to the rest of the class. Maybe they take a photo and present it. At the beginning of the session, I showed you students just choosing a photograph and presenting it, but also students love their phones and they love taking photographs. So get them to take a photograph. One activity I like is when students have done the unit in the course book. So if the unit of the course book was stages in life, linked back with the black and white photograph. For homework, I might say, I want you to take a photograph called Stages in Life and then bring the photograph to class and present it. One other tool I use something called Photobabble, which is a free online tool where you take a photograph, you upload it, and then you record yourself describing the photograph. And it's a really nice way to get students to present photographs if you're teaching online, for example. You get a password, you can set up a classroom, a sort of a safe classroom with Photobabble. You take your photograph. So the picture here shows umbrellas. It's from Turkey. And then there's the student describing where they took the photograph and why they took the photograph. So look up Google Photobabble. It's a nice little tool to use with your students, and it's very safe. Or you just get students to present. Record and show a video. I get students to make videos. They love making videos on their phones, and sharing the videos is another way of doing it. Perform a dialogue. At the beginning of the session, I showed you after a video, the students wrote a dialogue between a man and a woman. I'd then get the students to read the dialogue and perform it to the class. Show and tell. One activity I like is to get students to choose an object or a photo that's important to them, and they give a little presentation. And in the life books, we included some show and tell videos in a unit about your favorite possessions. And the picture there shows a Russian student presenting a dress that her mother made that was personally important to her, and she presents it. Students watch the video and then they choose their own object that they bring from home or photograph, and they give a little presentation to the class. Fantastic for presentation skills, great for building confidence, and it's personalization and creative thinking in the classroom. And again, pin your work on the wall of the classroom or put it on the classroom blog, the website, whatever it is. But students need to share their ideas. Of course, there's issues of sharing personal content. You need to be careful and control it. But if you keep it within the classroom, it's very satisfying, and it means students produce an end product, which is really important for their creative thinking. So we've come to the end. Those are my 7 tips. We define creativity in terms of big C, little c. Then we looked at creative thinking in terms of divergent thinking. And then I contrasted it with convergent thinking, critical thinking, and talked about the importance of the relationships of limitations. Break your routines, break your habits. If you've done the same lesson 5 times in a row, do something different with it. This is an important thing. You can't expect students to be creative thinkers if the teacher is not a creative thinker. Students will only be creative if the teacher's being creative, okay? So break your own habits. Ask the higher order thinking questions as well as the lower order, and get the students to generate questions, okay? Allow thinking time. Creativity is in the classroom, but also at home or when they're on the bus. So allow thinking time if you're asking students to prepare a presentation or so on, or write a story. And get the students to share like artists, share their work at the end of it. When they feel ready, don't necessarily pressurize them, but at some point they need to share their work. Okay, that's the end of me talking, but I'm happy now to take questions or comments or opinions. Any questions do we have? Those are my references, by the way, if anybody's interested in further reading. Some of the ideas came from myself, but also there's some of the reading and the references I've made out there. Just looking at the questions. Eleanor's asked me, what if students are just too lazy to think? I think one of the important things about creative thinking is about motivation. And if you introduce more and more creative thinking, I think it motivates, and you'll perhaps stop them being lazy because you're motivating them more. How do you create simple instructions for limited critical thinking activities? Critical thinking activities, I would need a separate session, but often critical thinking activities involve asking students the why question, asking them to give reasons for their answers and so on. Mr. Bean videos are fantastic. It would be great for higher order thinking. Fnu, you'd said, are they good Mr. Bean videos? They're great for generating creativity. Show a bit of Mr. Bean and then get students to predict what might happen next and so on. Emilina, how do we manage a student who doesn't want to be asked many questions or follow-up questions? Obviously, we're working with students sometimes who, for different reasons, might not want to use their creativity. And I'm not saying it's easy. Like all teaching, you have to bring students out of their shell. But I think creative thinking is kind of interesting because sometimes you have students who are very quiet in class. But actually, when you ask them maybe to do a piece of writing or to share a piece of work, like a piece of poetry or something, if they go away and think about it and then they have the chance to share it, sometimes students can come out of their shell. I once knew a teacher who did some video work with students, and he had a very quiet student. But suddenly, when he asked the students to do a little presentation to camera, the student loved YouTube videos and loved talking head videos. And suddenly she talked to camera in a way that she'd never spoken in class. And there was something about talking to video that gave her confidence. Christine has asked an interesting question. Tips on rubrics to assess students' creativity in their work. Assessing creativity is difficult. And there's interesting studies currently being done. If you Google the PISA tests, P-I-S-A, they're piloting a test in creative thinking because it's such an important 21st century skill. But I think you can do things like give extra marks for creativity or discuss with the students, get the students to define what they think creativity is and how it can be marked. And it depends a little bit on the task. Like if you ask students to give a presentation, you can give marks for originality and get students to vote on it and get students used to giving feedback. And that's one way of getting creative thinking, both in terms of, say, a presentation or a piece of writing, but also creativity in terms of students generating the rubrics to grade creative thinking. That in itself is a creative thinking task. So creative thinking comes in all sorts of different ways. Kitty or Andrew or Will, how are we doing on time?
We are doing fine. I think, yeah, so we may still have 1 or 2 minutes to answer some questions, but before that, can we just go through some other information first?
Sure.
And yes, thank you, John, for this very engaging, inspiring, and creative session. I love lots of the activities you have shared with the teachers. All right, so yeah, so for all the teachers, if you want to know more information about our different webinars, you can always follow us on our social, so either Facebook, or if you are in China, you can follow our China WeChat site. Can we go to the next slide, please? John, thank you. And lots of teachers ask about the certificate. Yes, you will get your certificate. So tomorrow, you will receive a thank you for joining us email. And in that email, you will see the link to the recording of the session. And also you will get a link to the certificate. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so this is how it looks like. And yeah, congratulations of getting the certificate. And also, you can always follow us on our National Geographic Learning's Asia webinar site, as you can see on the top. So that's where you can find all the upcoming webinars information. And also you can watch all the recordings of all previous webinars. Great. All right, and the last one we need to go through. So yeah, so many of you have asked about the materials, the book John has demonstrated, show you examples in this session. It's from our Life second edition. And if you feel, yeah, you are so interested in this program, you can also join our webinars 2 days later. That will be on November 26th. And in that session, our trainer will kind of demonstrate a writing lesson from Life elementary level. Yeah, I will also put the links of the registration of those 2 sessions in the chat. Ooh. Okay, here you go. All right, okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. John, at the same time, if you feel like there's 1 or 2 questions you feel really worth answering to all the teachers, please do.
Okay, let me take a look back at the questions.
If no.
Hassan's asked an interesting one about what if students are quite conservative to some extent. And I think sometimes we think that creativity and creative thinking in the classroom is all about the students doing some big presentation or writing stories. But actually, if you introduce little bits of creative thinking, asking the right questions, you know, it's about not necessarily about the students changing who they are. Some students will be more openly creative than others. But I think, you know, you're not asking about changing them, but I just think with the creative thinking type questioning, for example, you just start to get students more relaxed about language learning and perhaps that they don't have to stop being conservative. It's a question of employing sort of a strategy to language learning that sometimes is perhaps changing the way they've always done things. It always comes back to that breaking routines, breaking habits, and as teachers as well, breaking our own habits as well.
Last question.
Last question. I'm looking for one more thing. Aleli's asked one, how can I practice creative thinking? Well, I think this is an interesting one because, of course, teachers, yes, we can do creative thinking in the classroom as teachers and break our habits, but also in our home life, creative thinking is aided by reading literature, listening to different types of music, looking at art. There's a phrase that creativity is that you should steal like an artist. It's a phrase saying, and the Spanish artist Picasso said all art is theft, and creative thinking is about stealing ideas. So for example, any of the ideas that I presented today, you should now steal them from me and go off and try them. And some ideas will work for you and sometimes they won't. But if we want to practice creative thinking, we should always be stealing. What I don't mean is stealing as in plagiarizing. I just mean stealing an idea, trying it out, maybe saying who gave it to you, but seeing if it works for you. And that's a way of developing your own creative thinking. But read widely, look lively, look at art, listen to music, take ideas from colleagues and try them out. That's about how the teacher becomes more of a creative thinker themselves. That's my final message, Kitty.
Okay, thank you so much, John. All right, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today, and we hope to see you again very soon. All right.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye-bye.